This Dr. T video, Probability Basics, the addition rule, works a couple of examples finding probability using the addition rule. Now, as criminology, criminal justice majors, sometimes you may decide to review court cases. Reviewing court cases often allows us to test different theories and different concepts. In this example, we're looking very specifically at a sample, a randomly chosen sample of court cases across one county in the state where we live. We're curious to know whether a court's finding with prejudice or without prejudice happens differently across cases that are disposed as dismissed, guilty, or not guilty. We take, let's say about 393 different court cases to review, and here's what we find. We find that 156 of the cases that were dismissed with prejudice. 28 were dismissed without prejudice. 139 of the cases where the defendant is found guilty were disposed with prejudice. 25 were without. There were 37 cases that were disposed with the defendant found not guilty, but with prejudice, and 8 without. Now let's go ahead and get our totals. We want to make sure we have a total for each column, and we also want to have totals for each row. This is a cross-tabulation table. As we've seen before with data that are presented in a cross-tabulation, it gives us quite a bit of information. We get information on all of the cases that we review where the court found a specific disposition with prejudice and without prejudice. That's what we have here in the rows. And we also have the information about defendants in the cases we reviewed whose cases were disposed as dismissed, guilty, or not guilty. Now, let's say we're interested in figuring out the probability that a randomly chosen case has a defendant who is found guilty or that their case was dismissed. All right. Well, let's think this through just a little bit. Gone ahead and plugged in some abbreviations for all of these. So we're looking for the probability that we randomly look at a case that we reviewed, and the case that we review has a defendant whose case was dismissed, or the defendant was found, let's go guilty. All right. Well, this is an or. Why? Because someone's case generally is not going to be both dismissed with a guilty defendant. So these are mutually exclusive categories. You're not going to be both, at least in this example. So what we need to do is find the probability of those that were dismissed, and we are going to go ahead and just add it, hence the addition rule, to the probability of those found guilty. All right, we're interested in the number who were dismissed and the number found guilty, and our overall total number of cases that we reviewed is 393. Okay, so the probability that the cases were dismissed is 184 out of all the cases we reviewed. So divided by 393, we're just adding, plus the probability of being found, having a case where someone's found guilty. That was 164 divided by all of the cases that we reviewed. We can go ahead and add these two fractions. And then go ahead and do that division. So 348 divided by 393. And roughly, the probability that we would pull one of the cases we reviewed and find that the defendant had been dismissed, defendant's case had been dismissed, or the defendant in the case had been found guilty, it's roughly 0.885. Let's try another probability estimate using this same crosstab. Let's find the probability that a defendant is, let's go with found not guilty, and that the court also decided to tack on without prejudice. All right. Now, because the defendant's case can be disposed as guilty or not guilty, with or without prejudice, the events are not mutually exclusive. You can be found not guilty with prejudice or not guilty without prejudice. So in this case, without mutually exclusive events, we're going to figure the probability using the addition rule again. So we're going to find the probability that a randomly chosen case is disposed without prejudice or not guilty. Let's do an or for this one. We can go ahead and set this up the way we did in our previous example. The probability of not guilty or without prejudice is equal to the probability of not guilty plus the probability of without prejudice. Okay, so the probability of not guilty is going to be 45. There's 45 opportunities for us in our whole sample, 393 cases we reviewed. And then we want to take a look at the probability of without prejudice. All of the cases where the finding was without prejudice. That's 61. Again, out of all of the cases we reviewed. But we're really only interested in the not guilty or without prejudice. So we need to be careful that we're not double counting anyone anywhere. We actually are, though. We are double counting these 8 cases. Why? Because we used this 45, which is all the cases that were disposed where the defendant got a not guilty, and all the cases where the court found not guilty without prejudice. So we need to subtract and get rid of that 8. So we need to subtract the probability that the case we pull has not guilty and without prejudice. So that's the 8 out of all of the cases we reviewed. You can go ahead and do this math real quickly. 45 plus 61 minus 8. 98. Denominator stays the same. Again, do the math. And the probability is roughly 0.249 that we randomly pull a couple of cases, well, one at least, and find that in that case there was a not guilty disposition and the court found that without prejudice.